Right, hello everybody, and today we are going to be talking about something a little more unusual. We're not going to be talking about plants or anything, but rather composting with worms. So as you've seen from this title of this video, worm composting is known as vermicomposting, coming from the Latin word vermis, which means worm. So as I mentioned in my Composting for Beginners guide, there is a way of composting using worms. Worms are really excellent decomposers, and you can actually keep them in your home in a bin with some dirt and feed them regularly, and they will decompose the food waste that you are putting in there and thus produce worm castings. Worm castings are a really great natural fertilizer that can be used in the garden, on houseplants, flower beds, anything like that. It has a very high nitrogen content and is very good for feeding your plants and garden. So sorry for the weird setup today. We're in the basement for this very reason. So let's get into this. So if you want to vermicompost, you are going to need several things. First thing that you're going to need is a bin that has plenty of air holes drilled into it. Plenty around the top and on top of the lid as well is going to be sufficient. There are some discrepancies out there as to whether or not you should be drilling any holes into the bottom of the plastic bin. Some people say that it is beneficial for drainage. However, I have heard other people say that it is not necessary, because if you are doing it correctly, there should be no reason for you to have anything extra to drain off. Worms aren't going to escape out of these holes because they like to be in a moist environment as they breathe through their skin, and they don't like to be exposed to the air. So don't worry about your worms crawling out of your bin or anything like that. That's not really an issue. So it's up to you whether or not you want to put any drainage holes in the bottom of your plastic bin. I chose to put 4 small runs around each corner of the bin. That way, because I am new to vermicomposting, I do have like kind of a backup drainage system if it's needed. And as I create more bins and kind of expand the process, I will most likely not do any drainage holes on the bottom. However, those air holes on the top are absolutely crucial. Do not skip those. The next thing you're going to need is soil and compost. Some people use shredded newspaper as well, not entirely. However, like 25 to 20% of shredded newspaper, like on the top, can help insulate that bin. I opted for using a little bit of raised bed soil that I had left over, as well as some half completed compost. So I have some compost in here with some grass clippings, a few eggshells left, and just a little bits of food here and there. It's probably like 75% complete, but the small amount of food left in that compost will help these worms have some food, and I will let them go for a few days without feeding them. The next thing you're obviously going to need are worms. So I, as well as many other people on YouTube, chose to buy from Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. Very quick shipping. I got it in a day just because I live very close to their shipment center in Hanover, Pennsylvania. And you want to make sure that you are purchasing red wigglers, ideally. You don't want to go for something like a nightcrawler because they are very territorial worms, and that is not going to be beneficial in a small space such as a plastic bin. So red wigglers are really ideal. They don't mind being crowded. As for the count of worms, I chose to purchase 500 red wigglers. I chose to purchase 500 red wigglers. I've heard some people going from 500 to 1,000 in one bin. That's really up to you. However, I did not see the purpose for going up to 1,000 because it's A, more expensive, and B, these guys are going to reproduce asexually once they are in this bin and once they get established. So I'm not really going to overpopulate it. I'm going to let them kind of, you know, work out their own population system and not overcrowd it too quickly. And the last thing you're going to need is food scraps, of course. I've seen a lot of people blend up a kind of a food mixture of different scraps that they had, and just with like a little bit of water, some food scraps, nothing salty, fatty, dairy, or animal products. None of those can be added to compost or to vermicomposting. So keep that in mind. Just add whatever you would add to your regular compost, to your vermicompost. Ideally blend that up a little bit to make it easier for the worms to decompose. Next, you want to think about where you are going to place your bin. A lot of people choose to put it in their basement or their garage. My basement happens to be very cool, which is ideal for worms. You want to keep them around the 55 to 75 degree range. You don't want to expose them to any kind of hot sunlight or anything like that. So ideally, you're going to have them in a cool place in a basement or garage or somewhere in your home if possible. There are different ways that you can work around if you don't have space within your home. If it needs to be outside, put it in a shaded area. If it gets super hot one day, see if you can bring it inside or stick a frozen water bottle down inside there to keep the area cool. You know, do your research and kind of get crafty if you need to regulate the temperature if you don't have a space like a basement, ideally. And you never want to add water to your vermicompost. Ideally, the water that comes from the compost and the food scraps that you are adding will be sufficient for the worms. You want to keep the soil moist, but not soggy. Like I said, these guys can drown if they get in too much water. You don't want them to drown, and they breathe through their skin, so you don't want to let it get too dry. And the last thing I'll mention is just some things about inside of your soil. You want to make sure that you have a relatively neutral pH in your soil. If you have a problem where worms are crawling up the sides of the bin, it's probably because they're rejecting something in that soil, and you probably have a pH problem. So keep that in mind. Don't add anything too acidic or too alkaline. Try to balance that out and keep it relatively neutral. All right, everyone, let's come on in. We'll take a look at the red wigglers that I have, and we will put them in the bin. All right, like I said, I kind of apologize for the weird setup that I have going on here right now. I'm waiting on a professional lighting system, like a ring light, so we're just gonna have to deal with the basement light right now. All right, so here are some of the worms. You can see them here. Look at them. They are active. And it is normal, as you may see, depending on where you buy your worms, it is normal to have them not be super active if they were just recently shipped. So don't be concerned if that's something you're observing. So I hope that you can kind of see this sufficiently. But there we go. Just make sure there's no worms left in here. Again, I apologize for how dark this is. All right, everyone, so now that I have these worms in here, I'm just going to sprinkle some dirt over top here, just to allow them to be nice and covered up. So, whenever we are feeding our worms, a lot of people tend to do this sort of two-sided rotation. So what I mean by that is, on week 1, we are going to feed on this side of the bin and then cover it up lightly with soil. Then, on the following week, granted that all of the food has been decomposed by the worms, we are then going to feed on this side. And that will cause a migration of the worms from one side of the bin to the other side of the bin. So that way, we're not disturbing any worms by feeding in the same place over and over again and potentially damaging the worms, or and this is especially useful if you're harvesting worm castings. You definitely want to be doing the two-sided rotation. So yeah, everyone, I know that this is like very interesting, and again, this is my first time doing vermicomposting, so we are going to see how this goes. Fingers crossed everything goes okay here. I'm going to slowly monitor these guys over the next few days, seeing if they're rebounding, making sure they're doing okay. Give them some time to pick through any compost that is left in here, give them a few days to establish, and then I will definitely be putting some food in here, probably within the next week. So I hope that this video was relatively helpful, and I'm very looking forward to showing you guys how I'm feeding these worms and how this process goes. So yeah, we will see how this goes, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.